Sri Rickenbaum. Hindle Bantle Pindle Bantles. Hufflepuffles. Crisp, crankety, crimp-crap.
To combat and result in an end to particular physical symptoms. Another dream might provide a dreaming, peaceful interlude in which all stress is minimized, with the overactive output of certain hormones and chemicals quieted as a result. Such dreams will be greatly effective, but only for a short period of time, unless the conscious mind faces the beliefs that have been causing the imbalance. The heavy doses of chemicals introduced from the outside, however, give you an entirely different kind of situation and add new stresses. These dilemmas condition consciousness to believe its position to be even more precarious than it was before, and its sense of power and effectiveness is greatly reduced. Consciousness's experiences following such therapy may be those of elation, but it feels that any of its adventures rest on issues that it cannot understand, and its capacity to deal with physical reality is less secure than before. This is not the case with natural inner treatments that are carried on in individual behavior. These are the ones that should be understood and encouraged, say, by the psychologists.
11:13. Jane's trance had been good, her delivery even and very intent for the most part. It was snowing heavily. Resume in the same manner at 11:28.
Now, your body is your own living sculpture. Not only the shape, structure, and nature of its form, but the miraculous sense knowledge of its being and the unique effect it has upon others. The sculpture itself is also endowed with the power of creativity given to it by yourself.
Long pause.
If we explore the fragility of identity, identity emerges out of the soul, out of the feminine, in response to the masculine. An environment presents itself and has a certain amount of dis-ease in it. And the feminine sources a new persona, a new identity, in order to give birth to medicine. Medicine being something that will round off the asymmetry in the environment. If there's too much sociopathic energy, perhaps the soul gives birth to something more empathic, something more tender. The problem comes when the downward spiral of environment ensures a continual pattern of environmental or masculine form that is asymmetrical and causes a certain amount of pain, the response from the soul in terms of a new identity, a new persona, and the dishonor and the violation and the disrespect of that persona causing yet more pain, and then leading to a new persona that's adapting to the violation of the first persona. When the new persona is in turn violated and deteriorates, there is yet another response of a persona. However, each iteration of response to dishonor and disrespect becomes increasingly convoluted, increasingly dark, increasingly painful, and increasingly circuitous. If you think of the most direct and healthy expression of a persona, let's say you're born into a very unemotional, numb world, and so you respond to bring symmetry, to heal the environment that you enter by being overly emotional, by being overly sensitive, by being overly empathic. If this persona is honored, it will heal the entire environment. Meaning, if everyone responds with extra emotion and sensitivity and empathy to the extra emotion, sensitivity, and empathy coming in the new persona, and this is particularly the case in a child, then you see growth. I watched the Netflix version of Anne of Green Gables recently with Jen, and what you see are two stunted, emotionally distant and lonely grown-ups who think they need a boy. Because this is the problem when the wound becomes calcified and self-referential. When the wound is calcified and self-referential, the wound gets redefined by the cult that creates the wound as normal. Having defined the wound as normal, the cult's primary job is to maintain the status quo and protect the traumatized psyche from change, or so it seems, meaning the more trauma there is that goes unrepaired, the more we cling to certainty, however toxic. What presents itself are cult norms, which are generally quite toxic, but we cling to them. And so we see, in fiction, in mythology, and in storytelling, often a truer sense and a deeper sense of what's actually going on. And in this case, Anne, a young girl, is presented. Now, they asked for a boy. The cult, the status quo, always asks, you see, when a wound becomes self-referencing and becomes a cult norm, it ceases to be analyzed from the perspective of symmetry and whole, and starts to be analyzed from the reference point of itself. It's called self-referential, as opposed to referencing intelligence or love or symmetry or well-being or anything that would be considered intelligent, goes out the window. And what is instead referenced is this normal? And that reference is itself. And so, by that standard, I smoked a cigar before, and I smoked a cigar before that, and I smoked a cigar before that. It has become a norm. So, I should smoke a cigar again, referencing that that's the thing that I do. It's not referencing, is this the best use of $6? It's not referencing, is this what makes my wife the happiest? It's not referencing, is this the best thing for the environment? It's referencing the norm. And so the wound, in a certain sense, references the wound and almost becomes comforting as a set point in the balance between certainty and variety, which every human being needs a certain degree of certainty and a certain degree of variety. And when wounds are prevalent and institutionalized in cult norms, the most normal thing is the wound. So when a girl shows up in a cult that likes boys, they are not they're not happy, and they decide they have to send the girl back because she's a girl. Now, as the narrative progresses, the girl is, of course, exactly what is needed. More sociopathic masculinity in that household is not what is needed. Beauty, emotion, poetry, excitement, passion, empathy that transcends money, race. That entire community needs Anne, but they judge Anne in self-referential terms. They reject Anne in self-referential terms. They reject her for being an orphan. They reject her for being poor. They reject her for being having red hair. They reject her for not doing the normal things that are toxic to the cult but are nonetheless normal, including racism and a number of other things. And fortunately, the emotional truth in just 24 hours is so medicinal in Matthew that he doesn't want to give up what he didn't know he wanted, referencing cult norms. And an entire community begins to be transformed. So in a healthy dynamic, this is how evolution occurs. And it is the movement towards intelligence, well-being, and symmetry that breaks the spinning wheel, the stuck cult that's just spinning its wheel in a self-referential way. We go round because we go round because we go round because we go around, and actually moves it forward. So we have evolution, often unwelcome. You think about homosexuality in the United States. A desperate absence of warmth and affection between men, higher levels of loneliness that are growing higher and higher, emotional illiteracy, trauma, and a violation of the feminine in the man that is even higher than the violation of the feminine in the woman, because every human being has the masculine and feminine energy in them, and women are allowed to cry, or allowed to bond, or allowed to hug and repair the wound offered by a chauvinistic and sociopathic cult. But men are not. Men are shamed for showing symptoms of the wound. When men cry because their feminine self has been shamed, humiliated, and treated brutally by other men, and the cruelty of the sociopathic and chauvinistic woman, the men are castrated emotionally. They're shamed for their grief around being shamed in their feminine side, which deepens the wound, which means that the deepest wound in a chauvinistic cult is the feminine in the men who were not only given the message that their feminine self was trash like everyone else, including women in the cult, but were given the message that they were flawed for giving a damn about their own feminine. And so it further scars an already incredibly tender wound. And then there is no repair, because in a chauvinistic cult, there's nothing more humiliating, according to a chauvinistic cult, than needing a woman, or heaven forbid, a man, to comfort the wound. And so we just have a downward spiral. The brutality between men directed at women on the outside is a mirror of the brutality directed at the feminine self in men by both men and women, outside and inside. Because the feminine side in every man in the United States and other chauvinistic cults is devalued, dehumanized, patronized, humiliated, kicked down as unwanted, shamed for being unmasculine, and then further shamed and humiliated for grieving the wound caused by the first round of abuse, which means that the wound in the man is so painful and so numb that in order to stop the abuse cycle, the man internalizes the cult wound, denigrates his own feminine, dissociates from it, and having projected it onto the feminine in women, proceeds to treat it as cruelly and brutally on the outside as he was trained by men and women in his cult to treat it on the inside. We will not see an end to violence by men directed at women until we see an end of the violation and denigration of the sensitive feminine face in every boy and in every man by the chauvinistic and sociopathic women and men that train the boy to dissociate and abuse his own feminine self, and then turn around and blame the man for treating the woman the way he was taught to treat his feminine side. There is nothing more medicinal in this paradigm of abuse than for men to become affectionate with other men. And at the deepest level, this takes place emotionally. However, when a cult is afraid of the very change and the very soul, the very feminine that offers it medicine, it viciously attacks the personas that emerge to respond to the pathology of asymmetry and unbalance caused by a sociopathic cult. In that dynamic, homosexuality emerges as an identity and as a rebellion to the pathological wound of the feminine, where men say, I'm going to identify with the feminine traits more than the masculine traits, rather than be trained to abuse my own femininity. This is medicinal, coming from the psyche, coming from the soul, in answer to the wound. But in fear-based, shame-based, traumatized cult, the unfamiliar is automatically rejected as threatening, as the traumatic wounds from childhood are projected out onto the world, and uncertainty and unfamiliarity is viewed as a traumatic threat, as the abuser, who began out of control in a helpless state in a world that was unknown, becomes projected onto the global unknown, helped in part by the sociopathic deities known in the Old Testament, in which God is portrayed as a sociopath. The ultimate deity out there in the unknown, in the ether, is more sociopathic, is more cruel, is more barbaric and narcissistic and chauvinistic than your own parent, thus cementing the fear of everything that is unfamiliar out there. The sociopath in the family, internalized into the ego, projected out on the deity, makes everything unfamiliar terrifying, and the cult turns on and stabs out the medicine brought by the feminine self in answer to the wound to the feminine self. That is part of every man and every woman. We're not talking gender here. Every man and every woman has a feminine side, has yin energy, and every human dynamic, every exchange of energy, is a polarity between masculine and feminine energy. In communication, you have a speaker, masculine. You have a listener, feminine. Doesn't matter what the gender of the listener is. The listener is in a feminine pose. You have a giver, masculine. You have a receiver, feminine. The feminine in a man is the one capable of receiving, is the one capable of listening, is the one capable of following. But when that is shamed, you get these symptoms of absurdity, as in men driving around in circles refusing to ask for directions because they've been shamed in their feminine side, and they feel that it is weak to receive, because to receive is to connect with their feminine part that they have been told since birth is subhuman, just because the cult is afraid of change in a dominator chauvinistic paradigm that has become normalized in a wound that is the cult. This is all incredibly painful. It's incredibly sad. And there's no place to grieve this wound. Because rather than call a wound and swab the blood, we are asked to elevate the wound into a deity called culture that exists because it exists, and we are taught to fear change because change takes us into the feminine realm of the unknown. And the feminine realm of the unknown is the realm of the wound and the realm of our terror of the next traumatic event in a traumatically illiterate cult. How do we respond? Well, fortunately, Matthew and his sister welcome Anne into their home, and a slow process of bringing life to a man's heart, life to a woman's heart, life to the neighborhood, life to a village, life to a culture begins. But what happens when Anne is sent back to the orphanage? What happens when the medicinal energy and identity that comes out of the feminine, out of the soul, out of the psyche, is sent back, is met with hostility? When the virginal homosexuals beginning to take hold in a cult that hates and fears change are humiliated, when their sensitivity is exploited to shame and try and kill them off as an identity, when the medicine is pathologized as an abnormality rather than embraced as a medicine. This is the descent into evil. It is the descent into devolution. It is the descent into dis-ease and asymmetry, and the deterioration of the self, the whole, and of intelligence. Intelligence is the phenomena of expending energy to increase well-being. And high levels of intelligence take small quantities of energy and leverage them into very high amounts of well-being. And low levels of intelligence or counterintelligence are expending large amounts of energy to make the cult more toxic, more asymmetrical. Kind of like wasting energy moving this fucking cigar around and getting smoke in my face and pausing to do that. It's not intelligent. It's just normal. The breakdown and the cascade of healthy medicinal identities / personas that toppled in my life relate to the phenomena that an oak tree begins with a sprouting acorn, and in that state is incredibly vulnerable. One bite by a baby deer, one nibble by a rabbit, one step by a farmer, one step by a goat hoof, and that seedling with its first 2 leaves is shattered and is no more. And something else takes its place. Something else grows in to fill a void. If you cut down the old growth forest, second growth and more rapid weedy plants grow rapidly in to fill the void. They do not provide the same value, the same medicine as the original canopy, but are necessary to stop erosion and fill the void. When these are cut down, yet more weedy, scrubby things take hold. There is a process of a deteriorating ecosystem in which the grace, the complexity, the majesty of the rainforest canopy, with its many ecologies and its grand biodiversity, is reduced down to rapidly growing weeds desperately trying to survive in a sociopathic environment that is stopping the medicinal cycle of repair, of traumatic repair within nature. Because truly, if all of nature is deforested, the temperature volatility on the surface of the earth, much like the temperature and regulating skills of an individual human being, become extreme. The reason for the winds, for the low mortality rate of animals and plants in the desert, for the sandstorms, tornadoes, and increase in volatility in global weather systems, is that when you go from 130 degrees Fahrenheit down to 0 in the matter of an hour or so, because there is no temperature buffer in the canopy of trees. You see, what trees do is they function as insulation. So the earth and the area under the canopy does not heat up as fast, and it does not cool as fast, one. And two, the evaporation rate of thousands of gallons per tree per 24 hours into the atmosphere creates a humidity level which forms a secondary insulation. And what is gained for the planet with these two layers of insulation? There's actually three levels of insulation. There's the moisture canopy and the reduction in volatility and temperature below the cloud canopy, which is why in winter it's not quite as cold when there's a cloud canopy, and in summer it's not quite as hot. And so you have the cloud canopy, which is produced by the evapotranspiration from the leaves of the forest. Then you have the insulation of the dappled leaves of the trees. And then you have a secondary story of mitigating direct temperature. And then you have a humus, ground level of needles, and which is a final layer of insulation so that the ground doesn't heat up. And what this does is it reduces temperature volatility on the surface of the planet by several 100%. This reduction in temperature reduces the volatility, which is how fast and how erratically temperatures climb as the sunlight hits a desert in the morning and descend when the sun goes away. The reason deserts are so lethal for both organization or plant organisms and animals and human beings is adapting to that amount of volatility is very, very hard. But further, the sandstorms and increased winds that erupt when one part of the planet decreases in temperature at a rate of 2 degrees per 10 seconds, as a rapidly falling thing, and something else reduces in temperature at a rate of 2 degrees per minute, and something else decreases in temperature at a rate of 2 degrees per hour, you have thousands of percent in differential of regulation. And so it's the same kind of experience as a pedestrian walking on a highway and a bicycle driving on a highway, and a race taking place on the highway at 200 miles an hour. When those three different speeds meet, you get violation. You get if an individual gets hit at 200 miles an hour with a car, you get violation. You get trauma. And when these different temperature come together in the atmosphere, you get explosive weather patterns that cause global trauma. The trauma in the psyche that occurs when the authentic personas are clear-cut, and the secondary personas are clear-cut, and the third personas are clear-cut, is immense. There is a loss of medicinal canopy around the psyche, meaning that the psyche becomes increasingly reactive. The persona that remains, the identities that are able to survive all that clear-cutting and survive in a sociopathic environment, become equally reactive, become volatile. And so you have all this explosion in the DSM manual, where we now have more than 5,000 specific categories of mental and emotional disease, which boil down to 5,000 different descriptions of unregulation, discoordination, and volatile symptoms that are considered less than optimal and are often out of control. You see, at some point in the stripping of the psyche of its authentic personas, its medicinal personas, the ego can no longer control the rapid increase and decrease in anger, the rapid increase and decrease in loneliness, the volatility of the psyche's experience within highly adaptive sociopathic personas cultivated to cope in a highly sociopathic cult that clear cuts the authentic self and reduces it to desert, reduces it to mown grassland, reduces it to monocrops of corn by thousands of acres. It's too big for the ego to regulate. The cult has cut down the time frame, increased the level of addiction, increased the level of pain, decreased the amount of emotional literacy, decreased the amount of traumatic literacy, increased the level of intense sociopathic media, to a point where the ego is barraged with stimulation without the adequate canopy of authentic medicinal personas, which in our cult would be feminine personas, to regulate this barrage of violation. And the internal and the external, the microcosm and the macrocosm, are all fractal representations of the same pattern. It takes a certain amount of brainwashing in order to deny, in order to avoid seeing this pattern, which in a materialistic, chauvinistic cult that denigrates the feminine and with it everything inside, that denigrates the planet and with it our host body, that goes as far in the upper echelons of reductionist, materialistic, sociopathic, scientific, capitalistic cult thinking as to even speculate as to whether human consciousness actually exists or is just a aberration in the brain, and if it does exist, whether it has any point, and that whether it has any point beyond teaching us to be animals to survive in a sociopathic environment that is projected out on the ecology, that in essence reduces us to isolated egos that behave and are treated as animals, valued more for the money we produce than the humanity that we are. This is a deep cut to the psyche. Now, in my own cascade of internal personas, the first persona to be cut down was the empath, because the law in my family was thou shalt not feel. Two people in a traumatic state of PTSD who don't know how to deal with it do not want to get near their feelings. So, what? They have kids? And within a family system, you see, within a cult, the cult will try to give birth to medicinal personas. This is how a cult evolves. The cult evolves by trying to give birth to the very personas that will balance the toxicity of asymmetry that the cult has gotten stuck in a rut with. So we could look at the explosion of Asperger's syndrome. We could look at the explosion of ADHD and things of this nature as medicine if we understand what the wound is. If, for example, we understand that cult is by its nature caught in a rut that is self-referential, then medicating that wound would in part be to become more data-oriented, because data is never self-referential. If you truly follow science, it leads to the ultimate equation of intelligence, which is intelligence is the efficiency with which time, money, and natural resources are applied by human beings to create sustainable human well-being, which obviously includes nurturing and loving the host body that gave birth to us as a species and that supports our daily life, and does not include creating an ever higher toxic load in our fetuses, an ever higher chemical load in air pollutants, an ever higher level of toxic chemicals in our water, and higher pollutions in a variety of our foods. This is not intelligent. It is dogmatic. It is the natural byproduct of a capitalist cult that values the money that people create more than the people who create the money. If you follow that dogma, which is not intelligent, It is dogmatic. You get these wonderful success stories where people figured out how to shave a few pennies off of the cost of this product and that product and this product and that product by making it increasingly more toxic for the environment, for the workers, for the people consuming it, who are not paying attention to the toxicity levels. They're paying attention to the price in terms of dollars. Oh my goodness. This company offers fire retardant pajamas for my 6-year-old little girl for 30% less money than this other company. Now, the law doesn't require either company to disclose what ingredients is in the fire retardant material. But the brain says fire retardant, very good, and dismisses or doesn't even want to look into all of the different allergic reactions and different health symptoms that are showing up in children who are being exposed to chemicals that their parents can get no access to what is in these products unless they take the products and send them into lab only to find various carcinogenic materials. But the majority is just looking at the price. I got cute pajamas for 30% less, and the factories that want to make money rather than save people's lives know that the attention is to the cost and no one knows what's inside. And they are perfectly happy to go along with the charade, which is what it is, because the odds of someone getting sick from carcinogenic pajamas are much higher than the odds of a child burning to death because their pajamas weren't fire retardant. So you have these splits in intelligence that no one's paying attention to as long as the primary economic metrics are going up. In the United States over the last 3 years, life expectancy went down for one of the first times in 50 or more years. And the reason is suicide. But that's not relevant because the gross domestic product, meaning the amount of natural resources that were cut down, turned into something often toxic and useless, and passed on, went up at a fragile ecological moment in our species balance, where what we need is for things to be conserved, not accelerated in their cutting down and production. But we're measuring success by the opposite of what our species needs. This happens on an individual level, a family level, a cult level, and a species level, and the amount of unnecessary suffering at all levels of the ecological system, mentally, emotionally, physically, and psychically, are the byproduct of using fuzzy math, of ignoring the numbers. So the empathic persona in me that tried to connect and bring my parents into connection with their despair, with their pain, with their grief, with their loneliness, with their terror, was hit back violently by two parents who didn't want to feel, who didn't know how to repair the pain that they felt, and so didn't want to feel, who carried the cult shame that said that the people who feel the most in this cult are lower ranking than the people who are more sociopathic? What is the ultimate compliment in our cult? That something is cool. And this is self-referential. Oh, that's cool. That's cool. It's cool that that's cool. And so that's cool. There's nothing inherently advantageous or intelligent. If you, of course, create a continuum where you have warm and cool, and ice and hot a little bit further along, and you translate that into color, you have blue, you have reds, you translate it into feeling, you have numbness as you move towards the sociopathic. On the sociopathic continuum, you have empathy, which is warm, and you have dissociation, numbness, frozen, which is cool. That's what you get when you keep making something cooler and cooler and cooler. You go numb. You stop feeling. And this is what is being deified. The low end of the sociopathic spectrum, coolness, is deified precisely because it promises the dissociation from painful and humiliating feelings that have become the cult norm. You do not want to be numb unless what you feel when you're not numb is humiliation, shame, terror, guilt, and fear. Then you want to be numb. And coolness becomes valuable in two ways. One, it promises not to care. I don't care. I'm cool. I'm good. I'm fine. Meaning, none of this affects me. No problem. I'm cool. And we admire that in a highly traumatic environment precisely because pain, abuse, emotional illiteracy, shame, incest, violation does affect us, and it hurts. And in a sociopathic cult, this wound is transferred to the individual, and it's transferred with the message, we're fine. Nothing wrong with the cult at all. If there's something wrong, it's something wrong with you. And the individual is left holding the shame and left as in the role of the scapegoat, feeling unlovable, inadequate, painful, alone, and flawed. That it is honestly feeling the brutality of a sociopathic cult. And having lived in that shame and helplessness for so long, its greatest dream is not to imagine that the cult could possibly change. That's just too big to hope for. But rather to dream about one day not being able to feel any of the pain that is inevitable, to be cool, and not to be fazed by the endless barrage of stupidity that we can expect from a sociopathic cult.